Good morning, evening, or afternoon, or whenever it is you're watching this. This is number 3 as far as the sermons dealing with the triumphal entry. Triumphal entry number 3. And I'd like to share with you some points about the triumphal entry in detail. On Palm Sunday, Jesus served as prophet, priest, and king. The 3 roles in which he fulfilled the perfection of a prophet, a priest, and a king. As a priest, he came cleansing the temple. He became the sacrifice himself. He led the disciples through the Last Supper. Each elder of the home, the oldest male of the home, was to be the priest of their family during the Passover meal. And he also was the sacrifice himself, the most important action of his ministry. So the king entered in on a colt in peace with a following, with authority over the actions in the temple. So he's ruling as a king in several different ways, but he comes in peace. But more importantly, I'd like to talk about the prophet, his role as a prophet. He foretold both truths of God's in the law and the practical application for the future, both in the truths that he was speaking and in the application future. God's laws were being proclaimed. That's the primary role of a prophet. A prophet foretells, speaks forth the truth of God. It sometimes includes telling of the future. And in this case, he's going to tell of the future. Luke tells us that partway down the Mount of Olives, in this huge celebration, this kind of craziness that's going on with people shouting and singing, laying down their garments, waving palm branches, he drew near, and as he could see the city, and again, remember, this is a canyon where if you're on the Mount of Olives, you can look directly to Jerusalem, and we've seen many pictures that were taken from the Mount of Olives of Jerusalem. You see today the Gold Dome, the mosque, and to the side is another mosque, a black building. The reason you can see it so well from that position is you're on the Mount of Olives. So as Jesus is riding the donkey down the Mount of Olives, he can see Jerusalem. And so when he draws near, he wept over it. Now this is kind of unusual when you think that at this point, probably thousands of people are excited. They're shouting, save us now, empower us now, bring blessing to us now. And that's exactly why he came. Of course, it's a bit of a different blessing than they were expecting. But as king, as prophet, and as priest, he was indeed going to bless them. And they were seeing that he was the Messiah. They're celebrating. They're overwhelmed with joy. It's a party that's taking place. And he begins to weep. Now, the church has built a church building on the spot where they would say that took place. We don't know exactly where it took place, but somewhere on the side of the Mount of Olives, Jesus stopped and he said, "Would that even you had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you do not know the time of your visitation." It would seem they did understand the time of his visitation, and yet their expectations of him becoming the type of king that they wanted instead of the type of king that he was just not going to be bridged. They did not understand. We see a similar response in Matthew 23 and Luke 13. Jesus says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." What they were not willing to do was to understand, to readjust their expectations, to understand who Jesus really was. They were willing to welcome him as a king of peace who would change their world and give them what they wanted, but they weren't willing. They were not willing to understand who he was and understand this offering that he was bringing to them, because they did not understand at this point. And John says they didn't understand until he had raised from the dead. Psalm 17:8 says, "Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings." So David understood his dependence upon God. David understood his need to be under the wings of the God who protected him. And Israel was playing politics with a number of different groups. Different groups were playing politics with different nations, with different political powers that were there, and trying to establish their own political power, rather than simply crawling under the wings of God as he came in this visitation to bring to them new life. His weeping and words spoke of their rebellion and their rejection of God's will. How many times did he desire to bring them under his wings, to supply them, to bring to them their needs, to protect them? And they refused. He then proclaimed the future. This is the part of the prophet's task we seem to enjoy the most. We would love for God to tell us the future. I think we need to think twice, in that normally what we expect to hear about the future is not what God shares. Normally the prophets who shared future revelations shared that there was going to be a very difficult time ahead, and oftentimes severe punishment because of their rebellion to him. Occasionally there was a statement of, you can look forward to the future because God is going to be with you, but there was always the warning that if you refuse God's leadership in your life, this protection, this abundance in your life is going to be gone. So the prophet was telling the truth, and the prophet was enacting the truth. Prophets act out the truth and did act out the truth in the past. So Jesus, fulfilling his role as a prophet, not only told them the truth, but he acted out the truth as others had done in the past. In Isaiah 20, we see that for 3 years, he was told to walk around naked or wearing just what we would call underwear. Scholars disagree about that. It may have been that he had no clothes at all, or the clothes that he had on would have been embarrassing as it would be for us to wear our underwear. But for 3 years, he walked around essentially without normal clothes and no shoes, preaching to them about the future, about their rejection of God's will in their life. And then there was always the third part of that message that said someday God will bring back a remnant to those who worship him. Hosea was told to break the law and marry a prostitute. He named his children very sad names. And after she had left him, years later, he was to buy her back as a prostitute slave. Kind of crazy things to do as a prophet, but that was showing to those who would listen, to those who would understand through his actions what God essentially does when his nation of Israel rejects him. He buys them back. And Jesus, of course, would be the price that would buy back those who would place their trust in him. Not just those who are born Jewish, but anyone and everything could be redeemed by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jeremiah chapter 13 was to wear underwear and then hide the underwear for quite a while, and then later on, much later on, go find it, dig it up, and of course it would be in terrible disrepair. And his statement was, through these actions, that Israel was no longer worth anything. It's sort of like the picture we're given when Gehenna is used to depict hell. Things were thrown in Gehenna, that were of no more use. And these undergarments were of no more use. He also was told to wear a yoke of oxen, yoke for oxen, while he preached in public. Ezekiel did some of the crazier things, more crazy things. He was told to preach only by using his hands and by writing, but not to speak. Kind of reminds you of what God told Zechariah to do when he asked questions about John the Baptist's birth. He was in the temple, an angel was speaking to him, and he thought he would question the possible reality of him becoming a father. So he was not able to speak for 9 months. Ezekiel was told not to preach verbally, but to write it out and to act it out. And he was depicting the difficulty that God had in communicating with his people. They weren't listening, so why bother speak? And there's a very interesting verse that talks about when the prophet's tongue cleaves to his mouth, when the prophet's tongue is simply stuck to the roof of his mouth and he cannot speak, that's when Israel is in serious trouble. Paul also speaks about the reality of God not speaking to people because their hearts are so hardened. He's given up. There's no point in even trying. Ezekiel was told not to preach for quite a while, but simply to act out in difficult communication. He was told to eat a scroll. Some debate whether he actually ate it or if it was a picture of what he needed to do. It could have been both. I'm not going to insist on one or the other, but I think he wished he had some hot sauce as he was eating this we would call it paper, or it could have been vellum, animal skins that the truth was written down upon, and so he was to eat it and make it a part of who he was. These actions that give these pictures to drive home God's truth. One of the craziest things I think the prophets were told to do, Ezekiel was told to lay on his left side for 390 days as he preached, and then later lay on his right side for 40 days. That's 14 months of laying on the road and telling people, you need to listen. And perhaps he needed to go through those strange antics and these actions to convey to them, we're in trouble. We're going to be left in a very helpless state, unable to do what we want to do, which is where he found himself laying on his side for over a year and 2 months. Another thing he was told to do is cut his beard and his hair with a sword, and then divide the hair up into 3 parts, doing strange things with the hair to say this hair represents Israel as it's tossed in the air, as it's chopped up, and as it's burned. He was told to avoid mourning the death of his wife. I can't imagine this. And it would have been known by the people around him that his wife had died and he wasn't mourning, because mourning at that time was a very well-known experience. It was common that people would mourn in public. And so it was a very public thing to do. And he was told not to mourn in public for his wife who had died. It reminds us of Moses and Aaron being told not to mourn the death of Aaron's nephews. His sons Nadab and Abihu had offered strange fire, and God killed them, and they were told, because of their terrible infraction against God's will in their life, given the tremendous privilege of serving as priests very early on in these rituals that God was giving to them to teach them his law, that because they had offered strange fire, they were no longer of value, nor were they to be mourned when they die. I think in this case, with his wife dying, it was more a matter of she's like the many, many, many who will die. Because life is changing. Your normal life in your normal culture will no longer be the same. Ezekiel 8:8 he was told to cut a hole in his wall to show that they would be conquered, that there would be a lot of physical damage to Jerusalem. All of these actions were shared as an attempt to communicate to the people that something serious was going to happen because they were rejecting God's will. So in the tradition of the prophets, he verbally predicted the destruction of Jerusalem. This took place, as we know, in 70 AD. We can see the triumphal arch in the Forum here in Rome. Happened about 30 years after the prophecy that Jesus made. And indeed, Rome set up ramps and entered the city and found the city to be running with blood already because the Jews were in such turmoil politically that they were killing each other before the Romans came over the wall. Then Jesus entered the temple and began turning over tables, setting sheep and doves loose. Chaos took place. Birds were flying, sheep were running around, money was bouncing all over the stone floors, and the tables were upset. But of course, it was more than likely in a small area because they had guards there. But he was acting out what would later take place. He was making a prophetic action saying, when Rome comes in, you can expect this to take place. And no place was more important in the hearts of Jewish people than the temple. Now, this was taking place in the temple region dedicated to Gentiles. It was the largest area, and that it surrounded the other areas, the area for the Jewish women, the area for the Jewish men, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. They all surrounded each other. In other words, you started by walking through this large area for the Gentiles. Gentiles could come into that area. Many Jews used it as simply a shortcut. They didn't want to walk all the way around the temple, so they would come in one door on the side, go out another door on the side, and save themselves some space. They had no respect for the fact that God had set aside a huge area in his temple so that the nations could come and hear of him. They would know that there was one true and living God that could make a difference in their lives. And the Jews didn't respect that. And that's where the money changing was taking place. That's where the animals were being sold and traded. So he was acting out what would take place later. And he was calling condemnation on the practice that was taking place there. Rome would do the same thing, but in a very real way. The entire temple would be torn down. And Jesus was finished. Everything was cleaned up, and they were back to normal. Trading coins, selling animals, trading animals. But after 70 AD, that was not going to take place. Hadrian began to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem in 130. The temple was destroyed in 70. In 130, Hadrian decided to rebuild Jerusalem. 60 years for Hadrian to make that decision. And it only lasted for a few years, and then Hadrian destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, 135, 136. A very, very short time because the Jews rebelled against Hadrian. So in his actions, Jesus was proclaiming God's prediction. In the cleansing of the temple, it was a lesson that Rome was coming. And the temple was destroyed twice. And after Hadrian destroyed it, Jews were no longer allowed to enter Jerusalem. They could be killed as a result of walking into Jerusalem. He renamed it. To understand the episode, we also have to know what was going on in the temple. Not only was he making proclamation as a prophet, but as a prophet, he was making a statement of condemnation through his actions. Again, in the largest portion of the temple, the court of the Gentiles, high priest had set up this market, and this market was not necessarily bad in its own sense. People misunderstand that the exchanging of money and the exchanging of animals was goods. But what was going on with this exchange was not so good. One exchange was a monetary sacrifice. Everyone who came to the temple was expected to donate money. You were not to come into the temple without making an offering. And there were several places where they could make those offerings and drop in those coins. And we see not much earlier than this, Jesus commented on a woman who came, dropped in the last little bit of money that she had, the widow's mite. And he said she made a greater contribution than those that were setting in lots of money who could afford it. It was expected that everyone would donate money. But the common coin used in the Roman Empire was not acceptable. Almost all Roman money had something stamped on it that disqualified it as an offering for the temple. The Jewish leadership rightly had become very sensitive to anything that resembled idolatry. So most everything that was stamped on a Roman coin would be offensive. If you have a chance to travel through a museum, and there are several here in Rome and in other places in Italy, if you have a chance to walk through a museum that displays ancient coins, you will notice that there's something that would be offensive on one of those coins and would eliminate them as an offering. Usually there was a stamp of one of the Roman emperors. Now, we read about Caesar Augustus as the emperor when Jesus was born, and he was the first of many who would suggest and sometimes demand that people see him as a god. The word Augustus comes from augur. Augur means one who goes into understanding God, one who has a closer relationship with God, or one who is God. So there's this religious connotation to Caesar Augustus. And these Caesars understood that if people worshiped them, there was much stronger cohesiveness and a much stronger alliance with the country, with the government. So Caesar Augustus began this practice of looking up to the king, and he was the first king. His uncle, Julius Caesar, had been the head priest or the high priest of Rome. Julius Caesar was the one who looked into all of the gods' wills to see if it was time to go to war, if they were going to be successful in war, to look to the future. That was his job previously, and he is the one who established the possibility for his nephew, Caesar Augustus, to become king and to suggest that he had a much stronger standing in religious manners, as some of them came out and simply claimed to be God. Often the coins would be stamped with an image of a Caesar, and the Caesars claimed to be God. And because of that, they couldn't be used as an offering in the temple. On the other side, they would often stamp a god, an image of a god. You can see here in Rome in the museum near Termini, some of the coins that were stamped with Bacchus. It's the one that stands out to me that I remember. Bacchus or Dionysus, depending on whether it's Greek or Roman, you'd see this image stamped upon that. And Second Commandment says, make no images. So how can you possibly bring something that is breaking the law of God to the temple as an offering? It is simply unacceptable. So these were not tithes that were allowed, and so money had to be exchanged. Money that was used in the temple that did not have these things stamped on them. I imagine some of you have had bad experiences in exchanging money. Right after we arrived to Rome, we were walking by a money exchange near the Pantheon, and it's when Rome was still using lira, and there was a sign over the window saying that there was a certain charge not applied, that there would be no charge, and I don't remember which one it was, but this charge would not be applied to the transaction. But there are many ways in which you can apply charges to a transaction. So when this man from Germany received his money, and he was speaking in English, and he was swearing in English because he was convinced he would receive a certain amount of money back because the charge that they posted on the window as not being applied was not applied. But she said through the window, "Oh, but we charge for this." And I'm glad she was behind a very thick glass that wouldn't break, because I think he could have become violent with her. He was very angry about the exchange that took place. The exchange rate was horrible. So as people came and they were forced to trade their money in, they would receive money that was acceptable but at a much lower rate. So they would have to pay more money to be able to pay the tithe that they wanted to pay to the temple. So they were essentially being robbed in this. There's another arena in which they were being robbed. One would come especially to the great feasts, bringing animals to be sacrificed. It might be a dove if you were poor. It might be a sheep if you had more money. But there was to be an animal that would be sacrificed in the temple. And those two had to be perfect. And they were examined by those who were in authority. And those who were in authority would almost always find something wrong with the animal. So the animal would be rejected, but taken in trade. And the man would have to give some money and his animal to receive an animal that was the requirement and did pass the scrutiny of those who were in charge. And it was said that the animal that was rejected would then be taken back and held in a pen, and not too long a time brought out to be traded as an animal that was perfectly acceptable, and someone would have to give one of their animals and some money to get it. So they were being robbed. They were being robbed in the exchange of money. They were being robbed in exchanges that weren't necessary for animals. And the animals themselves were sold oftentimes when there wasn't an exchange. One historian said that a dove purchased in the temple could cost 20 times as much as a dove purchased on the Mount of Olives. Now, from the temple, if you could look over the wall or through a gate, you could see the Mount of Olives. Most of them had probably walked from the Mount of Olives across. That was the route that Jesus took, riding on the donkey. It was a very, very well-traveled trek from Mount of Olives and the Mount of Scopha across the Brook Kidron into the temple area. The temple area was on the eastern side of Jerusalem, so it was right on the edge of this ravine. You could see a place where you could spend a 20th as much for a dove, but you were paying 20 times more because you were now in the temple and the convenience of being in the temple. The priests had established a great scam. They were robbing the people terribly, and the people had little choice. If they wanted to do what God had told them to do, they had to work through the priests. The high priest at this time was said to be Caiaphas, but he answered to his father-in-law, Annas. Annas was really, we would call him the godfather of the high priesthood. And you would call him the godfather because it was what we would consider an illegal mafia kind of operation, and that they're stealing from the people. They weren't supposed to be in the priesthood, and that they didn't have the lineage. It was very important, if you were to take a position like the high priest, that you have the right lineage. And he did not. He was appointed by the Romans. He was dismissed from his position of high priest in the year 15. Now, the high priesthood should have been a lifelong appointment, like it's been for centuries for the Pope until Benedict stepped down. This high priesthood was a lifelong appointment, but he was disappointed. If you'll bear with me, he was unappointed. He was dismissed, but he maintained control over the high priesthood. His sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas were put in the place of high priest, and yet they all answered to Annas. Annas was the man in charge, and his sons and his son-in-law answered to him. And we see in the trials, Jesus went before Annas as well as Caiaphas. So Annas was the man in charge. Caiaphas was his lackey, his man who was up front in the position as everybody would have seen him. And it was very recently that they started this exchange moneymaker, this scam. It had not been all that long. One historian says that it was the year before or the year of Jesus cleansing the temple. So very shortly before Jesus cleansed the temple, this horrendous theft was taking place, and the people had so little choice about it. They had to make their offerings, and these high priests were making it extremely expensive for them. So Jesus' zeal for the temple drove him to act. He acted in cleansing the temple, not because there was a trade system going on, but because they were stealing from the people who had no other option, and misusing their authority to become rich at their expense. And again, it was an action that was prophetic, saying this is going to happen because of the evil that's taking place here amongst God's people. We see this as a major influence. According to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this was the action that Jesus performed that tripped the switch, that made the leadership decide, we want to kill him. They'd wanted to kill him for a while. They made the decision they wanted to get rid of Jesus somehow. But they would decide, because of this action in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because of this action, they were going to do it now. They're going to take care of Jesus now. In John, he adds to it the influence of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Not only were they looking to kill Jesus, but they wanted to get rid of Lazarus because his raising from the dead was so very, very important to the people. Now, this miracle business is interesting, and I'd like to spend some time with this in another video. But Jesus was frustrated with the nation of Israel in that they demanded signs before they would believe. And he even, at the end of his ministry, spoke to Thomas, who had to see Jesus and see his hands and his feet and his side before he would believe. And Jesus said, it's so much better for those whose hearts are sensitive, and when they hear the truth, they believe and they act on that belief. The nation of Israel had a reason for wanting to see signs, actually a couple of them. One is that there were many, many messiahs, false messiahs, men claiming to be the Messiah, traveling around Israel saying, you should follow me. And they were willing to be the Messiah that the nation wanted. None of them succeeded in overthrowing Rome. And in fact, they brought terrible, terrible warfare and destruction upon the nation of Israel by standing up against Rome, trying to be the Messiah that the nation wanted. But they needed to see a sign from Jesus, as John called them signs. They wanted to see miracles so they could believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, the last words given to us in Malachi are a prediction of the spirit of Elijah coming. And as we understand it now, the spirit of Elijah would proclaim the coming of the Messiah. And John pointed out several times he was not the Messiah. And each gospel writer emphasizes John was not the Messiah. It was a confusion issue. But it's not that John's role was unimportant. His role was extremely important. And one of the things we note about Elijah and Elisha, they both performed a number of miracles. So it makes sense that if the spirit of Elijah is coming And he's going to break in with this new movement of God. God's going to move in new and great ways. And it's the spirit of Elijah that's going to initiate this. Signs would be expected. I'm not saying they were correct. I'm just saying it's natural. And out of compassion, and because Jesus needed to verify himself as the Messiah, he performed a number of miracles. John emphasizes 7, but he also relates a number of other miracles that he didn't emphasize in his teaching. Mark includes miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. His miracles were very important, and his motivation was made up of a number of issues. One, he cared about the people. He was moved by compassion. So this miracle of raising Lazarus was moved by compassion, but even in this we see he was making a statement through his actions and giving lessons that would stay with those who were following him. He purposefully waited for Lazarus to die. Both Lazarus' sisters got together and sent somebody to say, Jesus, come back. Your friend Lazarus is ready to die. And Jesus waited. In his discussion with his disciples, we see that he purposefully waited, and when he found out that Lazarus was dead, then he traveled back across the Jordan and into Bethany and made some incredible statements. I'm the resurrection and the life. Now, had he said that at another time, I doubt it would have had the impact that it had as he's preparing to bring Lazarus back to life. So as he's performing this miracle, we wonder about his compassion if he allowed Lazarus to die, but in compassion, he raised him from the dead. And more importantly, he brought to the attention that he was indeed the Messiah. He is indeed the Messiah. And he can do crazy things. And he performed that miracle for a number of reasons. One of them was to draw attention to himself, to verify his position with God as God's Son, one and only Son, and as the Messiah. So the raising of Lazarus, tied with this cleansing of the temple, moved the leadership of Jerusalem. The Jewish leaders who should have heard what Jesus said and responded to what Jesus said in a very different way. It moved them to say, we are going to kill him, and it's this week. This week it's going to happen. So I hope you're not tired of this very, very important event in the history of Jesus' ministry. Hopefully you'll join us in prayer as we remember the many things that need to be done on our part during this time. Pray for those who are doing so much in the medical fields and how they are becoming so tired, and several of them have become ill and died. Nina, a recent frequenter of Rome Baptist Church, attendee of Rome Baptist Church, has asked us to pray for her family, and that several of her family members in New York tested positive for the COVID-19, and one of them has since died. So she asked us to pray for her family members who've tested positive and are having these serious medical issues, as well as the many others that are struggling, and for those who are having financial problems. And we, of course, pray that this virus would soon play itself out and we can work our way back towards a new normal. It's never going to be normal, but it will be a new normal. And hopefully we will have learned some important lessons through all of this. I hope that this is helping you, and I'll be sharing again tomorrow as we look at the week before Easter, the week before the crucifixion, the arrests. We'll look at some of the events that took place as we've tied Sunday's triumphal entry into some other things that took place a little later, the cleansing of the temple, as Jesus acted as a prophet. At one point, weeping as a prophet over what was going to take place over Jerusalem. Not new. Other prophets wept because of Israel's rebellion and the consequences that they were going to experience. Not new. But it was indeed new in that this prophecy was going to be fulfilled in a very short period of time, and it would change the face of the world. There were no real sacrifices after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, because the sacrifice, the one sacrifice, was offered up in Jesus, the sacrifice we can count on. Pray with me. Father, we thank you for another day of life, and for those who are struggling for life because of this virus and for any other reason. We pray for them. We would pray the entire world might rethink their priorities and understand that they need to come under your wings. No matter what the situation is in their life right now, they need to come under your wings and allow you to protect them, to provide for them, to lavish your love upon all of us. May we look to you, knowing that no matter what our circumstances might be, you will be there, and that will be enough. Amen.